The Colorado-class battleships were a group of 4 battleships built by the United States Navy after World War I. However, only 3 of the ships were completed: Colorado, Maryland, and West Virginia. The 4th, Washington, was over 75% completed when she was cancelled under the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty in 1922. As such, the Colorado-class ships were the last and most powerful battleships built by the U.S. Navy until the North Carolina-class entered service on the eve of World War II. The Colorados were the final group of standard-type battleships, designed to have similar speed and handling to simplify maneuvers with the line of battle. Apart from an upgrade in striking power to 8 16-inch guns, the ships were essentially repeats of the earlier Tennessee class. The Colorados were also the last American capital ships built with 4 turrets and twin-mounted guns. The change to larger guns was prompted by the Japanese Nagato-class battleships, which also mounted 8 16-inch guns. All 3 ships had extensive careers during World War II. Maryland and West Virginia were both present during the attack on Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941. Maryland escaped relatively unscathed. West Virginia was sunk in the shallow waters of the harbor but subsequently raised and repaired. All 3 ships served as artillery support ships during amphibious operations. Maryland and West Virginia were present at the last surface action between battleships, the Battle of Surigao Strait during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. The 3 ships, put into the reserve fleet after the end of the war, were scrapped by the late 1950s. Design. The construction of battleships armed with 16-inch guns was envisioned by the United States Navy General Board and Bureau of Construction and Repair as early as 1913, as the upgraded gun caliber promised twice the kinetic energy of the 12-inch gun then in service and half again as much as the 14-inch gun then being introduced. This weapon dominated the design of battleships between 1913 and 1916, just as the 14-inch gun had dictated designs from 1908 to 1910. However, while the General Board approved the 16-inch gun as early as 1911, the Secretary of the Navy felt that a move to a new gun caliber might make capital ships still on the drawing board obsolete. For this reason, he restricted the Bureau of Ordnance to proceed no further than blueprints for the new gun as a hedge against foreign developments. He finally approved construction of this gun in October 1912, and the weapon was test-fired successfully in August 1914. This success, along with the unofficial news in several naval publications of 15 and 16-inch weapons being adopted by Britain, Italy, Germany and Japan, the board considered abandoning construction of the Pennsylvania class in favor of an up-gun design. Such a move meant an increase of 8,000 tons per ship, twice as much as the jump from the Nevadas to the Pennsylvanias. Debate continued for the next 3 years. Each year, President Woodrow Wilson, Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, balked at the potential increase in cost and ordered instead that the design features of Standard Class be upheld. Daniels finally compromised with the 1917 design battleships by allowing their armament to be upgraded. This, however, was to be the only substantial change to be allowed. The design of the Colorado class, therefore, was taken from the preceding Tennessee class, other than the notable improvement of 8 16 .45 caliber in 4 dual turrets taking the place of the Tennessee class's 12 14 .50 caliber guns in 4 triple gun turrets. There was not a major difference between the 2 designs. Likewise, the Tennessees were the results of modifications to the New Mexico class, which had been the most modern U.S. capital ships to sea service in World War I and had attracted the attention of British constructors both serving with an outside sea and AMP. This similarity would carry over into the Lexington and South Dakota classes as the United States Navy increasingly standardized its capital ship designs. This was partly the result of wartime experience, when over 250 destroyers and more than 450 submarine chases had to be built quickly for service in the North Atlantic. The U.S. Navy had done this by a process almost akin to the assembly line, sticking to one basic design per class with a maximum amount of standardization and rationalization. Since the Naval Act of 1916 meant the imminent construction of 16 battleships and 6 battlecruisers, it was necessary to streamline production to save time and labor. Nevertheless, while U.S. battleships were standardized as much as possible, design improvements were incorporated whenever possible. Most of the changes in the Tennessees were incorporated prior to any of the keels being laid. However, plans for the underwater protection, the ship's main defense against torpedoes and shells that fell short of the ship but traveled through the water to hit underneath the waterline, could not be worked out in time. The problem was that tests in Kessen's experiments that would eventually prove that a series of compartments divided between being filled with liquid and being left empty would be a very effective defense against torpedoes were not yet complete. In order to commence construction of the ships as soon as possible, bids sent out to shipbuilding corporations noted that if they were selected to build the ships, an alteration to the design of the ships 3 months after the keels were laid must be allowed. General characteristics. The Colorados were extremely similar overall to the Tennessees, with a 624-foot overall length and a beam at the waterline of 97 feet. They displaced 32,600 long tons at normal load and 33,590 long tons at deep load and had a draft of 30.5 feet. Like the Tennessees, they were designed with a clipper bow to make the ships drier in rough weather. One improvement over previous classes was the location of the secondary battery in the superstructure rather than the upper hull, where it had proved to be excessively wet. Propulsion turbo-electric transmission, which had been used in the prior class, was retained here. Advantages included the ability for the turbines to run at optimum speed without regard to propeller speed, which led to greater fuel economy and range, and an easier subdivision of machinery, which increased the ship's ability to withstand torpedo hits. Each of the 4 propeller shafts was powered by a 5,424 kilowatt electric motor, fed by 2 two-phase turbo generators rated at 5,000 volts. 8 oil-fired Babcock and AMP Wilcox water tube boilers, each in its individual compartment, provided steam for the generators. Altogether, the ship's power plant was rated at 28,900 electrical horsepower to provide a flank speed of 21 knots, with a maximum bunker capacity of 4,570 tons. The Colorado's range without refueling at sea was 10,000 nautical miles. Armament main guns. The Colorado class was armed with 8 16-inch 45 caliber Mark Chapter 1 guns, which fired a 2,100-pound armor-piercing shell at a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second and a rate of about 1.5 rounds per minute to a range of 34,300 yards at a maximum turret elevation of 30 degrees. Development of this weapon had begun in August 1913, using a bored-out and relined 13-inch Mark Chapter 2 gun, with the promise of twice the muzzle energy of the 12-inch 50-caliber Mark Chapter 7 guns and 50% more than the 14-inch 45-caliber weapon used on The Nevada-class battleships, after an initial proof firing in July 1914 and minor changes, the 16-inch Mark Chapter 1 was reproved in May 1916 and production approved in January 1917. When the Colorados were modernized in the 1930s, these guns were rebuilt per standard Navy practice and redesignated 16-inch 45 Mark Chapter 5 and Mark Chapter 8. Secondary guns, 14 5-inch 51 caliber Mark Chapter 15 guns were installed to defend against enemy destroyers. This was reduced to 12 in 1922. The Mark Chapter 15 fired a 50-pound shell at a velocity of 3,150 feet per second to a maximum range of 14,400 yards at 45 degrees at a rate of 7 rounds per minute and was extremely accurate, with a danger space longer than the range to the target for distances less than 3,000 yards. As in the New Mexico and Tennessee classes, these were mounted in unarmored casemates on the main deck, one deck higher than in previous classes, to allow them to be manned in heavy weather if necessary. In 1942, the Mark Chapter 15 guns were replaced on West Virginia with 16 5-inch 38 caliber Mark Chapter 12 dual-purpose guns in twin turrets. On Maryland and Colorado, 10 Mark 15s were retained and augmented with 8 5-inch 38 cal Mark 12s in single mountings with protective shields. The twin turrets planned and later installed were at the time in short supply. The Mark Chapter 12 fired a 55.18-pound shell to a maximum range of 17,392 yards and a maximum elevation of 37,200 feet at an elevation of 45 degrees. They had a high rate of fire due to the being hand-loaded but power-rammed and the capability for easy loading at any angle of elevation. The introduction of proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells in 1943 made the 5-inch 38 even more potent in this capacity. Anti-aircraft guns, 4 3-inch 23 caliber guns were mounted initially for anti-aircraft defense. This was increased to 8 guns in 1922. These guns fired a 3-inch shell at a muzzle velocity of 1,650 feet per second to a maximum range of 8,800 yards and ceiling of 18,000 feet at an elevation of 45.3 degrees on a rate of between 8 and 9 rounds per minute. These weapons were replaced in 1928-9 with the same number of 5-inch 25 caliber guns, the first Navy gun designed specifically for AA use. They fired a 54-pound shell at a muzzle velocity of 2,155 feet per second at a rate of between 15 and 20 rounds per minute to a maximum range of 14,500 yards at an elevation of 45 degrees and a ceiling of 27,400 feet at a maximum elevation of 85 degrees. These guns were supplemented with 11 28mm machine guns in 1937-8. In 1942, the air defense system on these ships was overhauled completely. In addition to her 5-inch 38s, they carried 16 Bofors 40mm guns in quad mounts and up to 32 Olicon 20mm cannons in single mounts. The quad 40mm Bofors fired a 1.985 pound at a rate of 120 rounds per minute per barrel, nominal 140 to 160 rounds per minute when horizontal, to a maximum maximum range of 11,133 yards at 45 degrees and a ceiling of 22,299 feet. The 20mm Helicons fired a 0.271-pound shell at an average muzzle velocity of 2,725 feet per second and a practical rate of between 250 and 320 rounds per minute to a maximum range of 4,800 yards at 45 degrees and a ceiling of 10,000 feet. A second overhaul of AA defense was made between 1944 and 1945, as the Navy had found 20mm shells too light to stop Japanese kamikaze planes. This plus the higher approach speeds of these planes made these manually controlled guns obsolete. In the place, more quad 40mm Bofors mounts were fitted. Maryland eventually carried 40 quad 40mm and 18 20mm guns. Colorado's quad 40s were increased to 40, but she kept all her 20mm guns. West Virginia carried 40 quad 40mm and 50 20mm guns. Armor and underwater protection. The all-or-nothing armor scheme introduced in the Nevada-class battleships was continued here as throughout the standard-type warships, with armor suite virtually identical to the preceding Tennessee class. The exception was an increase in belt armor near vital machinery to 16 inches to correspond with the increased main gun caliber. Otherwise, the minimum thickness along the belt remained 14 inches. Upper deck armor was 3.6 inches initially and was later increased to 4.1 inch. Lower deck armor ranged between 2.25 and 1.5 inches and was also presumably strengthened during conversion. As with the Tennessees, the Colorados were modernized in the 1930s to improve the staying power. A new underwater protection scheme featured 5 compartments separated by armored bulkheads, 75 inches thick on either side of the ship, an outer empty one, 3 filled, and an empty inner one. In addition, the H boilers were moved from the location in previous designs and placed in separate spaces to port and starboard of the turboelectric power plant. This arrangement formed another line of defense, which would allow the ship to sail if one or even an entire side of boilers was incapacitated. A consequence was the chief aesthetic change between the New Mexicos and Tennessees. The single large funnel of the former was replaced by 2 smaller funnels in the latter. Other improvements imported from the Tennessee class included an attempt to move the forward torpedo room away from the 16-inch gun magazines, as the room was viewed as vulnerable. Also, the design called for the use of external, rather than internal, belt armor so that a break in the continuity of the side structure would not exist, which would minimize drag in the water and any corresponding waste of power. Class history. With fiscal year 1917 appropriations, bids on the 4 Colorados were opened on the 18th of October 1916, though Mary Lynn's keel was laid on the 24th of April 1917. The other 3 battleships were not until 1919-1920. With the cancellation of the first South Dakota class, the Colorados were the last U.S. battleships to enter service for nearly 2 decades. They were also the final U.S. battleships to use twin-gun turrets. The North Carolinas and 2nd South Dakota classes had 9 16-inch 45 caliber guns, and the Iowas used 9 16-inch 50 caliber in 3 triple turrets. Interwar modernization. Plans for modernization of the Tennessee and Colorado classes were made in October 1931, in part to take advantage of loopholes in the Washington Naval Treaty, while reconstruction under this treaty was allowed only to increase protection from air and underwater attack. It could include improvements in fire control and increased elevation for main armament, as these items were not listed in the treaty. Also, any changes made inside the hull could be justified as meant to increase protection, even if the outcome meant increased speed or longer operational range. Since the term blister had been specified to limit changes only outside the hull, such as main armor belt thickness and main gun caliber, modifications to the secondary battery were also outside the purview of the Washington Treaty. Included in initial plans was some protection against chemical shells which contained poisonous gas. Although the General Board stated in the late 1920s that decontaminating a battleship hit with these shells would not be possible, the ship would have to be scuttled. Also, the deck armor was to be bolstered with 80-pound special treatment steel, which would add 1,319 long tons to the displacement of the ships. The armor on the tops of the main turrets was to be made thicker. Fire controls were to be improved with the latest technology, and new shells for the main guns were to be designed. Later, 4 1.175 caliber machine cannons were to be added, and all of the machinery in place would be removed in favor of newer equipment so that the ships would not lose any speed with the great increase in weight. Blisters were also to be installed to improve buoyancy but not to increase the ship's beams any greater than 106 feet, so they could still use the Panama Canal when transferring from the Atlantic to the Pacific and vice versa. These improvements were estimated to cost about $15 million per ship. However, with the country in the throes of the Great Depression, not much money was available for the Navy. Savings of $26,625,000 could be realized by reconditioning the propulsion machinery rather than replacing it, which would lower the ship's speed. Adding protection against chemical shells could be dropped, along with development of the new shells. Nevertheless, the cost-saving elements of the later proposal were later dropped. The Navy asked the Secretary of the Navy to request money in the fiscal year 1933 to modernize the two classes from Congress, but the Depression worsened. Although proposals for modifications were still made, plans were put on hold and never carried out. In the beginning of 1934, the Bureau of Construction and Repair proposed that the Big Five, the 2 Tennessees and 3 Colorados, be fitted with anti-torpedo bulges so that the ships could benefit from increased buoyancy because of, among other factors, the normal procedure of leaving port with the maximum amount of fuel possible on board. The 5 ships were quite overweight and rode low in the water. For example, in June 1935, Tennessee had a normal operating displacement of 38,200 long tons, more than 2,000 long tons above the maximum emergency load her original design called for. This made her draft higher, meaning that the ship's waterline was down 5 feet 4 in. Construction and repair called for a bulge on the Colorados that would displace about 2,000 long tons and raise the ship's draft by 20 in. Installing these would be a year's worth of work, with each ship spending 6 months of that in a dry dock. The first month docked so that the hull shape could be determined, the next 6 sailing while the bulge was built, and the last 5 back in the dock so it could be added to the ship. 3 years later, the various Navy bureaus held a joint meeting to discuss a possible partial modernization of the Tennessees and Colorados. They were much different than the changes proposed in 1933. There were no provisions for extra deck armor, but many additions and replacements. To gain space for newer fire control systems, the ships were to be reboiled. The main and secondary battery fire controls were to be replaced, including new rangefinders and plotting room instruments for the main, while new Mark Chapter 33 anti-aircraft fire control directors were planned. The mainmast and M2 Browning functioning machine guns would be removed, and studies of the feasibility of a torpedo bulge, the addition of which construction and repair believed to be paramount, which would increase the beam to 108 feet and displacement to 39,600 long tons. Varying plans for these were complete by October 1938. None was a full reconstruction. Costs ranged from $8,094,000 to $38,369,000 per ship. However, as the money for the improvements would lessen the amount available for new battleship construction, and these would be better than even reconstructed old battleship, the Secretary of the Navy rejected these plans in November. Congress did appropriate $6,600,000 in 1939 for some of these improvements, including the bulges. World War II changes. With the beginning of World War II in Europe, the Navy began to apply lessons learned by the British to U.S. ships. The King Board of 1941 proposed sweeping changes to the secondary armament of the battleships to increase their defense against air attacks. These included the removal of all 5-in-25 caliber guns and 5-in-51 in favor of the dual-purpose 5-in-38, the addition of 6 quadruple 1.1-in machine cannons, and the cutting away of superstructure to clear arcs of fire for the new anti-aircraft weapons. An ultimate secondary battery of 16 5-in-38 in dual mounts, 16 both as 40 mm in quadruple mounts and 8 single alike on 20 mm was called for by the board in 1941. Although they were not certain the ships could handle the added weight and it would take a large amount of time in dry dock for these modifications to take place. With these concerns, an interim measure of 4 1.1-in guns was proposed by the board. However, the gun was not being produced in any great number very quickly, so a second interim solution was implemented. 3-in-50 caliber guns were added to all of the U.S. battleships except for Arizona and Nevada by June 1941. These were replaced on the 3 battleships in the Atlantic by the 1.1-in by November. They received them first because they were closer to a war zone. As these modifications were carried out upon the various battleships, much additional weight was added onto the already overweight ships, forcing torpedo bulges to be added so that a decent freeboard could be maintained. These would cost $750,000 and around 3 or 4 months in a dry dock. The King Board suggested that the deck armor be bolstered and 5-in-38 dual-purpose guns be added, but the Chief of Naval Operations decreed that any major changes such as these had to wait due to the wars raging around the world at the time. The addition of bulges, however, was approved for the Big Five, with each ship spending 3 months in dry dock at the Puget Sound Naval Yard. Maryland would be first, followed by West Virginia, Colorado, Tennessee and California. However, the estimates for how long the addition of bulges would take were too low. Puget Sound believed that they could complete work on Maryland in 123 calendar days, if the work would be given a priority equal to that of Saratoga's refit and higher than new construction. Only 2 of the ships had bulges added to them through this program, Maryland and Colorado. The attack on Pearl Harbor interrupted the refits intended for West Virginia and the 2 Tennessees. The surprise strike did not touch Colorado, which was at Puget Sound, and did not hurt Maryland very badly. However, West Virginia was severely damaged and needed a major refit at minimum. Little to no major modifications were made to the two active Colorados in the opening months of the U.S.'s entry into the war. All of the battleships in the Pacific Fleet had a constant order to be ready to sail within 48 hours in case of a Japanese attempt to invade Hawaii or the west coast, and could not be spared for any major yard work. Colorado was hurried through the rest of her refit with the addition of essential items like radar, splinter protection, 14 alike on 20mm and 4 1.1 in light anti-aircraft guns. Maryland received a similar treatment later, the only difference being 16 20mm S and no 1.1 in. Although tower masts were constructed for Colorado and Maryland, and a majority of the old cage masts were cut down by the ship's crews in the beginning of 1942, the ships could not be spared the time needed to install the new masts. The tower masts were placed into storage and not used until early 1944. Colorado and Maryland were greatly needed in the war zone, and as such did not undergo a major refit until 1944. Although minor additions and removals, mainly to the anti-aircraft weaponry, were made in between. Throughout the war, both ships saw their anti-aircraft battery changed constantly. Beginning in 1942, they carried 8 5-inch 25-4 quadruple-mounted 1.1 in guns, a greatly varying number of 20mm, and 8 50-caliber machine guns. In June 1942, Colorado had 14 20mm. Just 5 months later, this was up to 22, with 36 temporarily approved for a later time. By February 1943, both Colorado and Maryland had 2 more quad 1.1 in added and 48 total 20mm. A month later she was given an additional 10 50-caliber machine guns. November 1943 saw the removal of 2 of the single-purpose 5-in 51, the 6 quad 1.1 in, and a small number of 20mm in favor of 32 Bofors 40mm, 6 quad and 2 twin. Both ships finally underwent major refits in 1944. Here the remaining cage masts were taken off in favor of the tower masts. The 2 twin 40mm replaced by quads, a quadruple 20mm added, and a new radar fitted. Although more extensive refits were proposed by Admiral Ernest J. King, including the addition of 8 twin 5-in 38 more advanced fire control systems, and a second protective deck plating. The Bureau of Ships, after demonstrating what would have to be removed as compensation for the weight added for King's ideas, counter-proposed that of smaller reconstruction, like the ones given to the New Mexico class, would be more desirable. However, no action was taken until Maryland was struck by kamikaze aircraft. While undergoing repair, 8 twin 5-in 38 were added, but nothing else. Her conning tower was removed and replaced by a 50-pound special treated steel structure to balance the additional weight of the 5-in guns.